Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Joseph Lam, the director of the Confucius Institute. I welcome you to this wonderful lecture to be presented by Dr. Peter Marsh. But before I introduce him, let me say a few words about the CI and this special event. As you know, the CI, the Confucius Institute at the University of Michigan, is specially launched to promote Chinese arts and culture on campus. UM campus, and by Chinese arts and culture, we really broadly define it, not only traditional but really broad sense, and this is why we are talking about presenting this lecture more on Mongolian music as part of the globalized world and China. Today, and also this event is a very special event because it's part of the events leading to tonight's performance and tomorrow's night's performance of the wonderful new opera by Stella Song entitled The Red Silk Thread, to be produced by the School of Music. So this is the intellectual part of it and the contextual part of it to the performance tonight and tomorrow night. And I'm sure you all are looking forward to that performance. Now, let me move to introduce Professor Peter Marsh. He is a distinguished scholar of Mongolian music. He got his PhD from Indiana University and an MA from Wesleyan University. So he has just published a new book called The Horsehead, Fiddle, excuse my Bible book, The Horsehead, Fiddle and the Reimagination of Tradition in Mongolia. Current issues is a part of the title in the Current Issues in Ethnomusicology series by the Routledge Press, 2009. So I'm sure after you experience this wonderful lecture and the opera tonight, you may want to read more about Mongolian music in a globalized world. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Marsh.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Dr. Joseph Lam, Dr. Robert Swedberg, for inviting Otto Gantolik and I to participate in this event, the premiere of this opera, The Red Silk Thread, and also to Jiong Lee and Raquel Buckley for their work in arranging, doing all the logistics and arranging for our visit. Both Orta and I are very excited to be with you here this week, in this special week. As you know, The Red Silk Thread focuses on the life of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and founder of the Yuan dynasty in China. And it might be this historic connection between the Mongols and the Chinese nation that lead many people in China and elsewhere to believe that Mongolia is a part of China, and this is not the case at all. Although there's a province in northern China called Inner Mongolia, which at one time was a part of a larger Mongol Ols, or Mongol nation, Mongolia itself is today an independent sovereign nation state. In terms of ethnicity and language, the Mongolians are not related to either the Chinese of the south or the Russians in the north, a point at which the Mongols have a great deal of pride. Some of you might have seen this image back in December of last year, coming on Newsweek magazine, before Newsweek magazine disappeared as a paper publication. The cover story was about recent archaeological finds that might be related to the tomb of Genghis Khan, and there might be leads to it actually being found after all these years. But the article itself also mentioned the opening of a new statue featuring the great Khan mounted on a horse that was built atop a ridge outside of Ulaanbaatar, the capital Ulaanbaatar. The statue is enormous, as I think you can tell from this photograph, over 120 feet tall, and it brings to mind the statue of Jesus Christ rising above Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and such allusions may not be entirely out of place in Mongolia. Commentators have described this statue as the latest example of Mongolians reclaiming Genghis Khan in the post-socialist era, an era which began with the collapse of the Soviet-backed Socialist Party in 1990. While there's some truth to this, the process of reclaiming him really began in the beginning of the 20th century, when Mongolians were struggling to get out from under the rule of the Qing dynasty and to gain recognition as an independent nation. As the Soviet Union gained influence in Mongolia in the mid-20th century, it worked mightily to suppress the notion, then gaining popularity, that Genghis Khan was a fighter for Mongolian independence. Any mention or visual display of Genghis Khan in a positive light during this period was absolutely forbidden. If you must refer to Genghis Khan during this period, you had to include the phrase that he was a brutal feudalist reactionary in Marxist terminology. But, of course, these Soviet efforts to suppress the memory of Genghis Khan were ultimately in vain. And one can't help seeing the irony of, in the raising of a heroic statue to Genghis Khan in the same period that the statues of Soviet heroes were being ignominiously torn down and hauled off to the dumps in Ulaanbaatar. What I find especially interesting about this statue is not just the return of Genghis Khan, but the broad-based appeal of this reclamation effort. It's not limited to just the government, but extends out to the private sector and even down to common citizens as well. Think about this. A businesswoman from another country coming to Ulaanbaatar might fly in on an airplane called Genghis Khan, that Boeing 737 that's owned and operated by the Mongolian National Airlines. She would land at the Genghis Khan International Airport in Ulaanbaatar, would take a Genghis Khan taxi to the Genghis Khan Hotel in the evening, and after she dumps her stuff, may go up to the lounge at the top of the Genghis Khan Hotel, and in the bar have a nice drink of Genghis vodka, or if she prefers, Genghis beer. Clearly, the symbol of Genghis Khan is pervasive in contemporary Mongolian society, and this pervasiveness suggests meaning. This symbol continues to resonate with Mongolians of today, helping them to define who they are in this modern post-socialist world. There are other pervasive symbols in Mongolia today that represent this contemporary connection to the past. These include the Mongolian language, particularly the Mongol script, images of the horse, which is the most beloved of the 5 types of animals that the Mongolians traditionally herd as nomads, and of course of the land, and the Mongolian cultural heritage, which includes centuries, some say millennia, of cultural knowledge transmitted down from generation to generation to the present. I find that this cultural inheritance is often embodied and symbolized in both visual and oral ways through the symbol of the horsehead fiddle, which we see in this image. Each of these images represent a key symbol of state. And in my talk today, I'd like to focus our attention on this last symbol, the horsehead fiddle, and explore 3 distinct examples of how this complex symbol has been used to address or speak to important social issues and concerns in the present. What we find is that even as Mongolians become more urbanized and integrated with the global system, even as more young people grow up in the city with fewer and fewer ties with the countryside, these symbols of a nomadic pastoral past are becoming increasingly important, not less so. For our first example, we go back to 1989. This is still in the socialist period, months before the start of the protest marches and rallies that would eventually bring down the Soviet-backed socialist government. The deputy minister of culture in this time was a man named Johnson Norov. Now, I'm only going to present 2 Mongolian names to you in this talk, and this is the first one. Johnson Norov is one of them. He is known today as a composer, and in fact, Orta will perform one of his compositions in tonight's premiere, in tonight's performance. But in 1989, as a high-ranking official in the Mongolian Ministry of Culture, he had considerable influence over the shape and direction of cultural policy in the country. In my discussions with him, he told me that there were 2 issues that he was determined to address in his time there. The first was what he and others perceived as the swamping effect of Western culture on Mongolian society. If we look back to how the music culture changed in Mongolia in the 20th century, in the 1950s and 60s in particular, we see the profound influence of Western culture. And perhaps as a way to give context to the changes that occurred in the 1950s and 60s, let's go back a little bit more, if we would please. I'm going to show you some images of traditional music in the countryside. When you go deep into the Mongolian countryside, even today, you may encounter hints or reflections of the traditional musical culture that likely thrived in Mongolia in the early part of the 20th century. And I'm sorry to say, I've lost that page here. I'm going to have to open this up and get back to it. So hold on for just a moment here. Okay, here we are. So these are images that I took in my trip to the far western part of Mongolia, the far western edge of Mongolia, very mountainous terrain. And in these regions, you still find areas where people are nomads. They survive as nomads, and they have very little contact with the cities and the towns. And they maintain cultural traditions, cultural ways that are not unlike, as I say, what we might have seen back in the period of the early 20th century. And we can get some clues as to what this older musical tradition was like. So you can see what the time of year that we're in here. This is the winter time. And in the wintertime, the nomads will go into the mountain valleys, especially down by the riverside and near a river, and they'll herd their animals. They'll kind of live there. The valleys are a bit more protected. If you can see at the bottom of the screen here, there's a herder leading some of his herds up through the canyon. And we're going to go into this little encampment here, situated right by a frozen river. The man, the sort of head of the encampment, is this old man here, middle-aged. You can see there's not a whole lot of wood there. They build the pastures and such out of stone. And inside, you step inside this ger, the yurt, in which they live in, a very small space, circular, round felt tent. And they're making dinner, and we're just sort of enjoying this evening here with the family of this nomadic herder. And in comes a neighbor, this old guy from a camp. His home, his encampment is sort of over the hill. This guy is close to 85 years old, and he's still climbing the mountains here, herding the animals. And you'll see he loves cigarettes. I'll stop right here. He brought his fiddle with him, and he takes his fiddle with him usually when he goes out into the herds. He gave it to his friend here, his neighbor, to tune and to play some tunes for us, for the guests there. And so we're all gathered together, all of our friends and the family as well, gathered together in a very small space, sort of listening to him tune and then play a few tunes on this very old fiddle. He says ivgui, which is, this is not a very good instrument he's saying here. So the instrument is constantly going out of tune, and it's difficult to really play in tune. But at the same time, I think you can get a sense as to what the musical situation is like in this kind of situation. Very traditional, and where basically everybody's gathered around. A few people know how to play this instrument. You give them the instrument, and they start to play some tunes. Maybe a dance tune, maybe a tune to tell a story with. And notice how everybody's gathered around. They've had dinner, or they're about to have dinner. There's no real separation between the performer and the audience, right? This is all just participatory. I mean, everybody's involved in this, and everybody's close by one another. This is a very traditional way in which music is made in this area here. And also, this is music making not at a high virtuosic level by any means. It's just performing for the performance, for the particular event and particular context in which this is taking place. Let's go down over, we'll be to the next county over, where we meet a very well-known singer of epic songs, very long songs, and listen to him. So he's singing, this is a little excerpt from a longer story telling about a heroic hero who goes off with his horse to fight battles and such things like that. If you can imagine the situation, these very, very long winter evenings of family gathered around listening to an epic singer tell these very long stories. You know, there's no radio, no TV, no films or anything like that to distract you. This is your entertainment. This is the stories that you tell. And this is very traditional, the way things were done. The people of the family would be gathered around him. We didn't see this, I didn't frame this well enough when I took this image to show the family that's gathered around, little kids around there listening rapt to their grandfather perform these songs here, but that's the situation, that's the context for this. As well as you notice the images of his parents also there. He learned this within the family, and this is another element of traditional culture, is that this is an oral tradition passed on from generation to generation by learning, listening, and practicing it themselves. And oftentimes the instruments that they perform on are handmade as well. And this is all very much part of the tradition. I want to show one last little short video clip featuring a singer. In this case, a singer of overtone singing, humi, as you might know. It's a way of performing music that has its roots in the far western edge of Mongolia, in this region here. The singers say that they invented this type of singing. You probably know this In the West, in America, we often associate this form of singing with tuva in Tuvan throat singers. The Mongolians will say they taught the Tuvans how to do this. The Tuvans say otherwise, of course, but they're very close to one another, and it's probably very much a shared tradition among the Tuvans, which is a Turkic people, and the Mongolians and Altaic, the Mongolians and the Mongol peoples. Probably they learned this and shared this kind of tradition in this area here, but it's probably connected to the mountain context in which this tradition has its roots. So here's a performer named Singadort who is performing this song for us. So what he's saying is he was with us earlier. He's kind of describing to you, the people behind the camera here, as to how he came up with this here. He was walking with us through some of the valleys in the nearby county and just admiring the nature, admiring the landscape. And these tunes came to him. And he'd like to set these tunes to this song. So this is his idea. Okay, so there's two elements to this. This is very much a tradition in which the performers are making this stuff up as they go. I mean, this is very much an organic kind of tradition in which people hear things and they develop together and work up new ideas in this. It's not set, there's no clear set repertoire that they have to perform in a certain way. It's very organic in that sense. And also, I hope you can notice in each one of the examples we listened to here, the close connection between the music and nature, their environment, the environment in which they live in. They gain inspiration and ideas from the world around them here, the natural world and the physical world around them. So let's move ahead, if we would, please. With a bit of caution here, I don't mean to equate rural countryside traditions with the past necessarily. It's not a direct connection between it's not a necessary connection between the two. But we do find that in the countryside, like in the far western provinces of Holft, the continuation of cultural practices largely unchanged or very slowly changed in the present time, representing a way of doing things, a way of making music, a way of interacting with nature that actually is quite old. And so they provide a good sort of reflection or hint as to what a thriving musical culture might have been like before the onset of the 20th century. So now let's move into the 20th century, the period of the 1950s and 60s in particular, after Mongolia has become allied with the Soviet Union, the influence of the Soviet Union is becoming to be felt, and as well the influence of Europe and European musical systems, the European musical culture is also being felt. In if we go to this period after the, in the 1930s into the 1940s, the government made a real effort to push out to the nomadic communities and to bring the elements of we'll say a modern European or modern Western way of life. That means bringing health care to the countryside, hospitals, clinics, establishing schools, establishing local governments, extending the government from the center of Ulaanbaatar, from the center of the nation, and pushing that out to the countryside in all those different ways. So you have the rise of schools like this. Along with that came the building of cultural centers and the expectation that music will follow a new cultural order, not the way of the past, but the way of a new cultural order. And you begin to see this in this image from the 1940s. You still see an acceptance of traditional ways here. We have a solo fiddle player accompanying a dancer, or maybe accompanying a singer. This is fairly traditional. But I think you can begin to see some elements of Western cultural practice coming in here as well. For instance, the guy is sitting on a chair, right? Very upright, erect posture, as if he were playing a violoncello or a violin or something like that. Notice also they're both wearing costumes, especially the dancer is wearing a costume. And also the context of this is a theater that separates the performer from the audience. Very different from the traditional context we saw before. Move forward to the 1950s, and we see the rise of this strange kind of animal here with different kinds of folk instruments coming together. You would have never seen this in the traditional world of music here, where instruments that have very different roles to play in different parts of society are here brought together to form a small chamber ensemble, where the instruments are chosen because of how they sound, right? Because they have a certain sound together as an ensemble. That's the overriding concern here. The context in which these instruments are given meaning in the traditional world is not considered. It's kind of put aside. What we're going to focus on here is how it sounds, putting together sort of a hodgepodge of instruments that create an interesting little chamber ensemble, formulating them in line with, say, a chamber orchestra in the United States, in Europe, in European musical tradition. Extend this into an even larger scale in the 1960s into the 70s, the emergence of these folk orchestras in Mongolia, where you have different folk instruments performing the role similar to that you would find in a Western symphony orchestra. Okay? The Horsehead fiddles, do you see where they are here? Horsehead fiddle on to the side here, performing the role of the violoncello. You have the hochir, which is an instrument some of you in Chinese music might know as the erhu, performing the role of the violins. You have these plucked zithers here performing, I'm not sure what kind of role in a symphony orchestra. Of course, you have winds in the back and brass instruments. They even brought in the Buddhist dongqin. You see here the large horns on the side from the Buddhist monasteries, bringing those things in to, I guess, sound like a tuba or something. I'm not sure what it was. It's a very strange kind of combination. And then, of course, the choir in back, all sort of arranged in a way to have to be similar to a Western symphony orchestra, and of course, led by a conductor in the beginning, at the front here. So all this was connected as well as to the rise of these concert halls and theaters in the Western style, European style, in Mongolia, 1950s. In terms of education, promising students that showed talent in the countryside would be discovered through tests and other kinds of examinations, and then not left in the countryside, but brought to the center, Ulaanbaatar, where they would be enrolled in schools. And then in these schools, they would learn they might learn some Mongolian traditional music, but they would probably also learn Western classical music as well. And notice the Mongolian and the Russian masters sort of looking upon them. This is another part of, integrating a new European musical culture onto or in the context of Mongolia in this period here. If you were to learn a traditional music, you can go to a conservatory, go to a school of music in Ulaanbaatar and learn to play the Horsehead fiddle. But notice the elements you see in this image here. You learn the proper way to hold the instrument. You learn the proper way to tune the instrument. The fact that you have a piano in the background suggests that you tune it to a particular pitch, and you need to learn to play everything in tune. This is part of Western European aesthetics, to play everything in tune. It really wasn't a concern necessarily to people of the countryside, that you play everything exactly in tune according to what's set down by the piano. A piano also infers that the pitches you're going to tune to are unchanging. They're unchanging. In a traditional culture, basically you tune to whichever pitches work best to the song. It's kind of a flexible sense of intonation. So you see, we're kind of learning a new way of aesthetics, even with these traditional forms of instruments here. And there's another part of this too. The Soviets brought into Ulaanbaatar, into the schools of music there, a Italian-trained Russian violin maker who was sent to the schools to teach the Mongolians how to make and repair violins, which he did. But while there, he sort of noticed the Horsehead fiddle and thought of ways in which they could develop the construction of the Horsehead fiddle to make it sound more like a European violoncello. And this is what they did. And so really the violin, the Horsehead fiddles that we see today, the Horsehead fiddle that Orta will be playing tonight, is of this new construction from the late 1960s into the 70s, developed from drawing techniques of the European violin and violoncello making traditions. Okay, so all of these are all elements in this new musical culture. By the time Johnson Norov assumed his position in the Ministry of Culture in the 1980s, he was beginning to see the negative effect of this cultural development on the state of Mongolian traditional music. He feared that this traditional music could not survive this flood of Western, or as Mongolians called it, Russian influence. Johnson Norov told me in an interview, quote, "You see, the policy of the Russians was such that we had to accept Russian or European art and culture, while at the same time we had to leave behind the traditional arts. Thus, our people moved away from playing the Horsehead fiddle in the same way as they moved away from riding a horse or driving, or as they moved away from playing the Horsehead fiddle in the same way as they moved away from riding a horse to driving a car," unquote. He perceived this abandonment of traditional Mongolian culture by young people for Russian and European forms of culture as a threat to the nation's cultural integrity, and justly so. The other threat to this cultural integrity came from China, but curiously not from the Han Chinese. This threat was posed by Mongolians living in the northern Chinese province of Inner Mongolia. Soon after taking his position, Johnson Norov accepted an invitation to visit an important Horsehead fiddle player in Inner Mongolia, with the aim of strengthening cultural ties between the People's Republic of Mongolia and the People's Republic of China. What he found there frightened him. The Inner Mongolians had developed the Horsehead fiddle tradition to a degree far beyond where the Northern Mongolians had. Their technique, sound, instrument construction all showed a high degree of technical development and achievement. And this concerned Johnson Norov. "I saw this Horsehead fiddle ensemble," he told me, "and remember thinking that it did not have the real Mongolian Horsehead fiddle sound. The Inner Mongolian fiddle has a relatively higher tuning than in Mongolia, and as a result, their fiddles do not have the pure Horsehead fiddle sound that we have in our fiddles." The term pure is a contentious term in the relations between Mongolians and Inner Mongolians. Mongolians from the north often dismiss Inner Mongolians as not being real Mongols because of the perception that their blood is intermixed with Chinese blood. He's reflecting this bias in his comments. Johnson Norov goes on to say that it was the Mongolians, those from Mongolia, who should be developing the Horsehead fiddle tradition and introducing the tradition to the rest of the world, and not the inner Mongolians. Rather than generating inter-ethnic feelings of pride for a shared musical and cultural tradition, which both sides share in this trip really had the opposite effect on Johnson Norov, spurring him to go back to Mongolia and to begin efforts at cultural regeneration. He says he came back to Ulaanbaatar after this trip and immediately set to work composing what would become his Symphonia, the first concerto, solo concerto, or concerto for solo horsehead fiddle and orchestra, which, by the way, is a piece that Orta gave the North American premiere of 2 years ago at Stanford University. In 1989, Johnson Norov used his influence in the Ministry of Culture to transform a sleepy annual festival of modern music into a festival of the Horsehead fiddle. 5 days of concerts, workshops, and exhibits ensued, all focused on promoting the Horsehead fiddle. The final concert featured a massed ensemble of fiddle players that was also nationally televised, a first for Mongolian television. Johnson Norov said he hoped this festival would wake people up. Quote, "We wanted people once again to pay attention to the Horsehead fiddle, because for a while people didn't care about the instrument. But I expected that when 180 Horsehead fiddle players would perform together on one stage, people would be impressed and would take notice," unquote. Johnson Norov was the first to clearly articulate the need to isolate the Horsehead fiddle in both its image and sound and promote it as a national symbol. This had really not been done before. And he was pushed to do this, first out of fear that the Russian culture was threatening the survival of the Chinese cultural heritage, and second out of fear that the Chinese, quote unquote, inner Mongolians perceived as Chinese, would appropriate what was left of their heritage as their own, leaving nothing for the Mongolians. For Johnson Norov, promoting the Horsehead fiddle in this way was really a question of the survival of national culture. His aim was focused on the Horsehead fiddle, but it was clear to everyone that this symbol referred to a broader sense to the Mongolians' cultural inheritance from the past. So in this sense, his promotion of the Horsehead fiddle as a national symbol was an effort to use this element from the past to address important social issues and concerns of his present. For the second example, let's move forward by 3 years to 1992. The ruling Socialist Party has collapsed, and a new government has taken its place, for the first time in Mongolian history, elected through a multi-party democratic election. The government was quickly trying to rebuild the institutions of state for a new era and to find ways to legitimate its rule. For many Mongolians, this meant finding a way to connect, as Carolyn Humphreys puts it, to the moral authority of the past. What better way to legitimate your rule than to show continuity between it and a revered figure of the past, such as Genghis Khan? Some of this was done by posting images of Genghis Khan in government buildings, having characters dressed as Genghis Khan and his entourage participate in state ceremonies and events, and publicly calling upon Genghis Khan, the spirit of Genghis Khan, to bless this new country, this new government, and its nation. This feeling was well expressed in a pop song of this period, in which the singer asks Genghis Khan, "Can you forgive us Mongolians for forgetting about you?" Clearly, though, the new president in particular was looking for more. In 1992, he was approached by a famous Horsehead fiddle player in Ulaanbaatar who told him that Genghis Khan had a court fiddle player who always accompanied the Khan and played his Horsehead fiddle for his enjoyment and also at state ceremonies and events. This is a legend that I and other Mongolian scholars contend arises from a misreading of historical documents. But the idea that Genghis Khan was a court fiddler and that there was a court fiddler and a court fiddle was just too good to let go for the Mongolian president. In 1992, he issued a presidential decree calling for the creation of a special fiddle that would be housed in the Mongolian parliament as one of the quasi-sacred symbols of state. And this is exactly what was done. As you can see in this image, this is the new fiddle, newly constructed, right in the beginning here, called the Turin Han Hor, or state fiddle, being conveyed, officially conveyed to the Mongolian parliament, where it is encased in a large box in one of the special rooms in the parliament area here. Notice how old this fiddle looks. It's not really a modern fiddle. It was actually constructed, as I say, in 1992, based upon the image of a famous painting from 1960s showing this elderly man with a long beard sitting with a horsehead fiddle. This is, like I say, this is an image from the 1960s, which itself is sort of an imagination of what fiddle players may have been like back in the early days before socialism. I hope you can see the similarities between these two fiddles here. The Turin Han Hor now sits in this meeting room in the parliament where the president accepts and meets with visiting dignitaries. Here's an image from 2006 when our esteemed President George Bush went to Mongolia, the first sitting American president to go to Mongolia, meeting with the Mongolian president with other and basically sacred symbols of state, the most prominent one being, of course, Genghis Khan right behind them, sort of peering down over Bush's shoulder. But notice off to the side there, on the right-hand side, that's the Turin Han Hor, also making its presence felt in a symbolic sense. So in this example, we see the conscious use of the past to address or speak to important social issues and concerns of the present, namely the need for the new government to claim moral authority to the past. For my final example, I'd like to move to the present. Jonan is a rap artist in Mongolia, well known for his songs criticizing government corruption and greed, as other rap artists have done in Mongolia. In his recent video, Mini Notagig Natad Ulte, Leave My Land to Me, Jonan uses elements of the past mixed with images of a dystopian future to criticize the current direction of Mongolian society and its leaders. The video begins with a group of young people rising out of a hole in the ground, like survivors of a global apocalypse. These people stagger through the land, denuded of life, no grass or water, birds or trees. This is a barren and forbidding land. The people in this group fall to the ground and find buried in it fragments of the past, their past, representing, of course, what has been lost, what is no longer there, except as memory. Each of these fragments turns out to be one of the key symbols of the Mongolian identity I listed at the beginning of this talk. The first thing they find is an image of Genghis Khan, then an image of flowers in a pasture and an empty water bottle, representing, of course, a land that's no longer able to sustain life. And finally, a picture of an ancestor, that picture we showed before here, of an ancestor playing a horsehead fiddle. The lyrics make both direct and indirect reference to the objects being found. The lyrics, leave my land to me. Don't just leave yourself. Don't kneel down before money. It's not king. This focus on the land is in reference to the debates surrounding the rapid growth of mining activities in Mongolia. Gold, silver, and other valuable minerals have been found in Mongolia, particularly in the Gobi Desert. And international mining conglomerates have expressed interest in mining them and shipping the commodities to China and elsewhere. Given the high price of gold, in particular, this represents a potential income of billions of dollars for this very poor country, Mongolia. And the Mongolian governmental leaders for the past decade have been basically falling over themselves trying to make deals with these foreign companies. But there's been a backlash, especially from local communities in the Gobi that have experienced the effects of the early mining that's gone on, including the draining of water resources from a very sensitive ecosystem down there. Lakes and streams have just disappeared, leaving local nomads in a very difficult position. They're asking if this rush to cash in on mining is occurring at the expense of destroying the Mongolian land, and with it, Mongolian ways of life. The lyrics of this song go on here. Our ancestors left the lands to us, but we sold it. Are we forgetting our ancestors? The real treasure doesn't exist underground. It exists in our intelligence, our blood, in our land. We trade the gold for money, but we can't eat money. We eat meat, and meat requires grass. Before 800 years ago, our ancestors didn't want to dig this land. They gave their life for this land. 50 or 60 years ago, when Mongolian troops went to battle Japanese troops in the Battle of Hawking Gall, a famous battle site in eastern Mongolia, my grandfather didn't tell his grandmother that he would die for her, but he told the land. If oil doesn't exist, we can live. But if the water disappears, we can't live. We are influencing our descendants. You guys don't understand, but soon you will find that one blade of grass is more valuable than gold. You'll soon understand that you can't eat the gold. You can't drink just any fluids. You can't drink just any fluids. Don't forget the ancestors from money. It's more than money. You can live without these treasures. I'd like to show you this video now. powerful song this is. You may have noticed the direct and indirect references to music in this video. The Horsehead fiddle and the plucked zither, known as the yatuk, sound at the beginning and end of this song. In the beginning, the actual sounds of the fiddle and zither blur into an electronic music that imitates the sound and texture of these two instruments. And then at the end, the actual instruments come back at the very, very end of the song here. The framing of the song, by the sounds of the fiddle in particular, seem to resonate or allude to the traditional ways legends and epic stories were told, suggesting that this, in some ways, could be a song. Put it this way here, suggesting that this could be something of an epic, sort of like a legend being told, as if this were a legend being told to a future generation or something like that. But also sort of connecting this song and the performance of it to the past. What's also interesting to me is that these artists are not nostalgic for some golden age in the distant past, the time back before the 20th century. Rather, they seem to be nostalgic for the present time, for now, a period when there still are pastures with abundant grass and water, when the spirit of Genghis Khan is still present. Jonan seems to be implying that if we are not careful, we may look back to this time as a time of abundance, a golden age that could be lost by short-sighted decisions. I hope you can see resonance to discussions that we are having in our own society about the fate of nature in relation to the threats of global climate change. These are real concerns. These are real concerns, and in this case, Jonan finds that fusing rap with traditional sounds gives his meaning, his message, that much more power. In each of the three examples we've looked at tonight, we see how integral traditional music has been in the broader debate or discussion in Mongolia about the future direction of their country in this post-socialist era. To put it in other terms, we might say that the Horsehead fiddle is playing an important role in the process of national rebranding of the national brand, we could say. Indeed, the packaged nature of many of these symbols, such as the Horsehead fiddle, makes them easy to turn into commodities, like real commodities that could be sold. What's also interesting is how younger generations are picking up these older symbols like this and reworking them, fusing them in a way, fusing the old and the new in interesting new ways. The past is important and is becoming even more so, even as Mongolia becomes much more urbanized and globalized, and even as the meaning of the past is in constant transformation. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. Thank you. If there's anything you'd like to discuss or any questions you have, I'd be happy to help you out here. Yes, please.
Thank you. That was a fantastic talk. Could you please say a few more words about Senga Dorj and his vibrating music within musicological history or culture? Thank you.
Senga Dorj, you mean so sort of the place of this song form, this genre of singing. It's a technique of singing. In Mongolian sort of history or Mongolian music in general, it's called humi, or humi. Humi is the word for throat, and that's really what it is. It's throat singing. It's a way of singing that's produced by closing off the larynx, kind of closing it off in a special way, manipulating parts of the throat, the cheeks, the nasal cavities and such, to produce 2 or sometimes 3 tones at the same time. So it's a very, very interesting sound that they can create here. We may even ask Orta if he can give a demonstration of this at some point here. But this is a technique that really has its roots in just one county in one province of Western Mongolia. This is where it seems to have sort of come up. When you ask the people there, where did it come from? They say, nature taught us how this works. Some say that they heard the sound. So this one county happens to be very on or very close to a mountain that's considered a sacred mountain in Mongolia. And this community says that, well, basically it's a mountain that stands before a very broad plain. And when storms blow in, they blow in across this plain and then go right up the side of the mountain, producing a great deal of wind. And the herders around there say when the wind blows over the trees and the rocks, it whistles like this. It makes this sound. And then these elements here, the trees, the rocks, they taught them how to perform this. So there's a real belief, this is another element here. So they learned it by imitating nature. On the other side of this, you have to remember too that these are people who believe that spirits reside within the mountain, the rocks, the trees and such. And so in a sense, by imitating the sounds of what these things make, when they sound like this, the Mongolians feel they are, in a sense, kind of taking up some of the spiritual energy, kind of absorbing some of the spiritual energy of these elements as well, and kind of almost like reflecting it back to the spirits that are there. So there's a spiritual element on this as well. Which is a part of this world here. The musicologist Ted Levin from Dartmouth University has done a great deal of research on this. In Tuva, they have similar stories about this, of hearing it, the wind as teaching them how to do this. Other people say they listen to the stream, the kinds of complex overtones that a stream makes as it bubbles along on the ground. If you've ever had the opportunity to go into nature somewhere and encounter a stream where there's no other sounds around you but the sound of this stream, listen very intensely to this stream and you'll hear as it bubbles over rocks and such, creating a whole series of different kinds of pitches and overtones to the basic pitches. And these people, they live in the countryside. Sound, being able to hear, is very important to survival. It's a survival mechanism. So they listen to the sounds of these natural phenomena, and they try to imitate that. They listen to that, and they respond to that. Okay, so this is kind of the roots of this, the history of this song form. But it, since it sort of emerged into an artistic song form as well, it emerged from direct imitation into an actual song form that people will sing around and sing songs using this technique, as we saw here. But it's in the context of Western Mongolia, it's wrapped up with the place, a sense of place, and also a sense of spirituality as well. If I want to add one more thing to this here, in the 1950s, the cultural leaders thought they had something really cool here. So they brought, and I think it was in the 60s actually, they brought some of the best singers from Hoft, from where this region was, to Ulaanbaatar to found this in the School of Music there. And so now you can go to the School of Music in Ulaanbaatar and learn Humi in a conservatory-like setting. Of course, devoid of all cultural sort of background to this, right? You're just learning the way of singing. And today, if you see singers coming from Mongolia, by and large, oftentimes these are singers who are trained in the schools of music, like this. So it's a very complex history. Yeah, thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Is the music of Red Silk Thread related to Mongolian music in some way?
That I'm going to turn over to the composer, Stella. Stella, what do you...
Yes, I can answer that question. Good afternoon. I'm Stella's son, and thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. It's just amazing, and thank you all for being here. Yes, the music is somewhat crafted around this. I mean, I have used certain Asian elements and did a bit of research with music from Mongolia. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we'll try this play for us this evening. So I tried to craft the music with certain sensibilities of that, and of course myself being Asian, Chinese American, I have a sensibility towards that as well. So we did include that.
But I gather from the lecture that there's not much relationship relationship between Mongolian music and Chinese music?
Well, I think there actually is. I think there are elements that are traceable to this. I mean, when we look at especially the folk types of music, I think that's where you find certain elements that are similar. And then the instruments have similarities. The Moikur is there's the pipa, and then there's these other instruments that are sort of, they're all culturally related in some way. So I'm not a political bent, so that's not my issue. My main concern is the music and what I can derive out of that. So, for example, the opening of the opera has the idea of strumming of open fifth and fourth string instruments. We have a piano with us for our performances today and tomorrow, but it's actually scored for open string instruments. So thank you for that question.
Fascinating. Yes, and back, please.
Yes, I recently came back from China's Inner Mongolia province doing research on Mongolian music in China.
Oh, fantastic.
And one of the topics that I found really interesting was this relationship between Inner Mongolians and Mongolians in Mongolia.
Uh-huh.
Can you speak more on that relationship from the Mongolian side?
From the Mongolian side, Mongolia used to be, up until through the, it used to be part of one larger Ols, one larger nation, go back several centuries. When Mongolia came under the rule of the Manchu Qing, when was that? 17th century? The Chinese historians here, I think it's the 17th century. They basically, of course, Mongolia had invaded China on a number of occasions. The Chinese, even the Manchu dynasty, was fearful of the Mongols and what they could do. So they tried everything they could to divide and conquer, basically. So they divided up this Ols, Mongolia, between the north and the south. The divisions were culturally already there, but they made that very clear. So the part that is present-day Inner Mongolia became a part of the Qing dynasty, and the part that was today Mongolia, or a big chunk of it, came to be known as Outer Mongolia. So that's where we get the term Outer Mongolia. It comes from the Qing dynasty. And that term persisted all the way up until 1911, when the Qing dynasty finally ended. But the boundaries between outer and inner were, they're porous, but by and large, the Inner Mongolians began to develop a separate identity to the Outer Mongolians. And especially after the 20th century, as China built its political boundaries and Mongolia built its political boundaries, there was no more back and forth between North and South. So you have the development of two very, very different sort of Mongolian societies. And so the Mongolians believe that the Mongolians look to the Inner Mongolians and really don't know who they are, because since the very early part of the 20th century, there was very little back and forth between them. And especially as tensions between Soviet Mongolia and Communist China grew in the 1950s and 60s, there was actually animosity there. So almost no interaction between the Mongolians in Mongolia and the Mongolians in Inner Mongolia. One of my friends is a scholar at the Academy of Science, and he says in this period of the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, there was absolutely no communication between the two scholars, between the two lands. But one time, one of the scholars from the Academy of Science in Mongolia got a chance to go to Inner Mongolia, Horsehead, and meet with scholars there. And when he came back a few weeks later, all the other scholars gathered in a conference room and sat around and like were listening to him as if he said, as if he had come back from Mars. To find out what is it like, what kind of food do they listen to, what kind of music do they listen to, what is the city like, and stuff like that. Just almost no knowledge about what life is like for Inner Mongolians, in that situation. As you might imagine, where there's lack of knowledge, especially cultural knowledge, there grows prejudices, right? Preconceived notions as to who they are, and especially without this contact, these prejudices grow, and that's sort of what's happened, especially in the 20th century. So many Mongolians have developed sort of attitudes about who the inner Mongolians are that are based upon prejudiced ideas, and so you see a lot of that. The scholar Bullock out of Cambridge University wrote a whole book on this subject. You probably know this, the book on nationalism, hybridity and nationalism, where he addresses the whole history of this, and it's a very sad story, actually, between the two. Things are becoming a little bit better these days because there is more back and forth between the two. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, because while I was there, I interviewed a lot of inner Mongolians,
Mm-hmm.
and they often spoke of Mongolia as sort of a safe haven for their culture, even though their music in China is sort of being Hanicized.
Yeah.
But the impression that I got from them is that the outer Mongolians, or Mongolians in Mongolia, didn't, or more looked down on them because they weren't real Mongolians, or their music wasn't real Mongolian music. So I was hoping that you could speak more on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically I touched on that in my talk, as to that perception that way. You have to think of it this way. I think for the inner Mongolians, Inner Mongolia is their homeland, right? They've been there for hundreds of years, centuries upon centuries. They're not immigrants from Mongolia. This is their homeland, right? But it's since become a part of China. And I think for many of them, they feel as though they're in diaspora. They're in kind of that they almost feel like they are immigrants, and that the real homeland is up there in Mongolia. And yet the Mongolians in Mongolia don't perceive it that way, unfortunately. And it's a conflicted view of who the inner Mongolians are. And I have friends of mine who I just don't understand sometimes what their attitude is about inner Mongolians, but it's a very conflicted, difficult situation. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Thank you, please.
So I wanted to talk about the rap song a little bit, because I thought it was very interesting how, on the one hand, it's resisting the foreign influence in mining, particularly Western influence, yet the chorus is built around pretty traditional Western chord progression, 1 flat 7, flat 6, 5, 1 on an Aeolian bow. So does that, I'm curious if you could comment a little bit on the position of musicians in Mongolia at the present time versus colonial influences like that.
Yeah, it's funny. They wouldn't see it as colonial influences. They would see it as just borrowing a really cool chord progression, I think. Because I've listened to some Mongolian rap songs and such, and I think they're really cool. I bring them back to my friends in the United States, and they say, "Oh, I know that song." It's like the exact copy of a rap song from wherever here in the United States. Some of the group, it sounds very uniquely Mongolian in the context of Mongolia, but actually they're doing what rap musicians and really artists are doing everywhere, especially rap musicians, is just listening very, very widely to rap music in the United States, but also in France, Northern Africa, Korea, Japan, China, listening, just taking bits and pieces that they like and creating something new, right? And that's what they're doing, I think. And it sounds cool. I would say that's probably where it comes from here. It sounds like what they would like to do. But at the same time, there's no... Mongolians would say, yeah, rap is a Western thing, but at the same time, it's uniquely Mongolian because it's in the Mongolian language. The setting, the songs, everything, basically the lyrics, the way the lyrics are written is very Mongolian. It follows very strict Mongolian tradition in terms of the literature. The way even, there's a great deal of, I think this is true also in rap music in the United States, but in Mongolia, the lyrics follow a literary tradition that actually goes back by centuries and centuries. So the great deal of care is taken with the lyrics there, making it very Mongolian. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that a Mongolian listening to this wouldn't hear necessarily Western music turned Mongolian, they'd hear a Mongolian pop music. See what I'm saying? Yeah. It's a fascinating question, though.
One last question?
Okay, so one last one. Yeah, please?
You spoke a lot about the Horsehead Fiddle. I was wondering two things about other Mongolian traditional instruments, if they had flutes and drums.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I didn't see any women playing the Horsehead Fiddle. Do
Mm-hmm.
women play traditional instruments, and do they form ensembles and have singers also with them? You did show some singers, but they were just soloists with one instrument.
Yeah, right. The very good. So the question is about other forms of traditional music in Mongolia. There are, and also what's the role of women in the musical culture out there, traditionally speaking. I'll start with the first one here in terms of instruments. There's a wide variety of instruments, but by and large, the Mongolian musical tradition is vocal. By and large, vocal, and instruments oftentimes are used to accompany vocal music or to imitate vocal music. So you have the flutes, the different kinds of flutes, different kinds of plucked and bowed instruments, almost no percussion. Almost no percussion at all. And really not that many wind instruments either, very few wind instruments. Mostly are stringed instruments like this. Imagine, I mean, these are instruments that you can carry with you as you nomadize, right? You're not going to have pianos. Strap it onto the back of your camel or something like that. This is not going to work, you know. The camel will get pissed off or something like this here. So instruments that are easy to carry, also easy to fix, you know, easy to make, and that can fill the space of a small gear, right? So very small scale, simple instruments in this sense, like that. As for women, there are in music kind of gender specified roles of musical instruments, and you know, there's all kinds of traditional restrictions against women playing the horsehead fiddle and some of these other instruments. It was thought like women should not do overtone singing because it makes them infertile. Okay. And women should not touch the horsehead fiddle, not even touch it, much less play it, because it's a man's instrument. I think it's probably associated, the horsehead fiddle is associated to the horse is often associated with the man. The man plays the role of herding the animals, the women plays the role of milking the animals in a sense. So there's these kind of old style gender roles through there. You're right, I've heard of no professional musicians who were women up until the recent times, but actually in the past, since 1990, there have been quite a few actually of women who have gone into the schools, gotten degrees and gotten jobs as professional female fiddle players and musicians and all kinds of stuff. So things are becoming much more open for women now than there wasn't in the past. That's a fascinating question, you know, about the role of women. Good. Well, I want to thank you all for your attention and your questions, and thank you very much.